Good evening and welcome. So such a great capacity crowd, loud and good looking. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the National Book Award finalist reading. I'm Luis Jaramillo, the interim director of the School of Writing here at the New School. We're so pleased to welcome back our longtime friends and collaborators, the National Book Foundation, the presenters of the National Book Awards. The graduate and undergraduate writing programs at the New School share the National Book Foundation's mission to celebrate literature and expand its audience. As Dean Scobie reminded us at the awards ceremony earlier, sorry, not awards ceremony, that's tomorrow, the medal ceremony where all the finalists get these beautiful medals. The first modern writing workshop started here in 1931. We appreciate all that the National Book Foundation does, and we are very honored to host tonight's event. It's not every day that we get to have people wearing medals on this stage. It's really the closest thing the literary world has to the Olympics, and it's very exciting. I'd like to thank Harold Augenbraum, Leslie Shipman, Pam Tillis, and all of our student volunteers, Lori Lynn Turner, Gregory Collins, Justin Sherwood, Brian Case, and all of our AV friends. Tonight's host will be Justin Torres. Justin Torres is the author of the novel We the Animals. His short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, Granta, Tin House, and other publications. He has been a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford, a Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and last year was named one of the National Book Foundation's 5 under 35. He's really a wonderful writer. Please welcome Justin to the stage.
Hi, guys. So I was really honored when they asked me to host this. It's a big deal, and I'm happy to be here. They told me to make some remarks and kind of be funny, which is nerve-wracking. And I was just like, all right, I can tell a funny story about writing. I can do that. And I wasn't really worried about it until last night when I was Skyping with my boyfriend. He lives in London. He's English. And he was like, so, did you write a script? And I was like, script? No, I didn't write a script, no. And he's like, Royal Baby, you're not going to wing it, are you? He calls me Royal Baby. I didn't actually mean to share that with you. Anyway, starting off strong. And so he's like, you're going to wing it, are you? I was like, wait, I'm not going to wing it. I'm going to tell a funny story. And he's like, why don't you run it by me? So I start to tell him my story, and his face is migrating into his neck. He's just like, and he's like, you could tell that story, which for an English person, it's like, don't do that. It's like, you could get into that leaky canoe, you could do that. And so I'm like, don't could me. And so I'm like, well, everybody laughs when I tell that story. And he's like, there are different kinds of laughter, aren't there? And I'm like, go on. And he says, well, there's nervous laughter. And then he just stops. And I'm like, you're not gonna list any other kinds of laughter, are you? And he's like, well, you get the point, don't you? So he convinced me to tell a different story, which I will. If you want to hear the other story, find me later, buy me a drink. You'll laugh, you'll cry, I'll cry. It's a dark story. But I'm going to tell a later story that he convinced me to tell, which is very short. It's about the first time I gave a reading, which was in San Francisco. And I was signing books afterwards. I'd never signed books before. I'd never had my own book signed. I didn't know that it was this thing, which is often very marvelous. You have this kind of chit-chat, nice moment with people. But sometimes people just bring it, They've got their minute and a half, and they're like, I'm gonna tell you something. We're gonna connect, So this woman comes up, and she's like, I had a really fucked up family. And I was like, did you? And she's like, yeah, I could write a book about it. I was like, you could. And she's like, well, I'm not really a writer. I don't really have a book in me, but I've got other ways of dealing with it. And I was like, what do you do? I didn't really want to know, but I kind of wanted to know. And she's like, I'm a dentist. And then there's an addendum. A year later, I was back in San Francisco. The paperback came out. I was giving a reading, and this man comes to the reading who I kind of know. We're like Facebook friends, and he's like, "I heard you on the radio telling this story about this dentist." I tell this story a lot, and he's like, "What did she look like?" And so I describe her, and he's like, "That's my dentist." And I was like, "No." And he's like, "I knew it. I knew it as soon as you said it on the radio. Like, that's my dentist." And I was like, "Really? But why?" And he's like, "She does good work." And then he says, "All the gays go to her." Which, I don't know. This is why I don't live in San Francisco. But I think he was onto something, and the point is that there's something about good work that, whether it troubles us or scares us or provokes us, it's necessary. And when it comes to writing, it's very necessary for us to kind of seek out good work and be in its presence. And so that's why we're all here tonight. I would like to suggest that tonight we're all gays in search of the good dentist. And so I would like for, well, first I'm going to explain how the evening is going to work. There's going to be 5 groups of readers, 5 groups of 4 readers, 1 reader from each category: young people's literature, poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. Each reader will read for approximately 5 minutes. And now I would like to ask all of our good dentists to rise, and we will applaud them. Our finalists, please rise, and we will shower them with applause. Great. And so I'm going to introduce Group 1, which is Young People's Literature finalist Kathy Appelt for The True Blue Scouts of Sugarman Swamp, Athenaeum Books for Young Readers, Simon & Schuster, poetry finalist Frank Bedart, Metaphysical Dog, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, nonfiction finalist Jill Lepore, Book of Ages, The Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin, Alfred A. Knopf, and fiction finalist Rachel Kushner, The Flamethrowers, Scribner, Simon & Schuster. Come on up, guys.
Okay, before I start, I'm pretty sure that my mother is streaming this. And so, hi, Mom. Thanks. So just had to get that out of the way. Okay, the only things you need to know are that Jaeger Stitch is an alligator wrestler. She's the world champion alligator wrestler of the Northern Hemisphere. And the Sugar Man is a Yeti-like guy. He's cousin to Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and he has a pet rattlesnake named Gertrude, an enormous pet rattlesnake. But how, you might ask, could Jaeger Stitch get her greedy little hands on an entire swath of prime swamp? Answer, by getting her greedy little hands on Sonny Boy Boku. The Boku Corporation had owned the swamp for like 350 years, even before a little transaction called the Louisiana Purchase. As part of the deal, a crafty pirate named Aloysius Boku bought the swampland for a song. The confusing waterways and the massive cypress groves of the Bayou Tortorel provided the ideal hideout for his enterprising gang of buccaneers. Of course, the Sugar Man was completely aware of Aloysius. The pirates didn't seem to be doing any harm to his beloved swamp. Plus, they kept the alligator population in check with their frequent alligator roast, a point that his pet rattlesnake Gertrude appreciated on behalf of her fellow rattlers, which alligators have been known to eat from time to time. Moreover, the pirates weren't trying to hunt the Sugar Man down with their pesky cannons and muskets or poke him with their little swords. But then came the chanty. Pirates were all about chanties. They had a chanty for raising the mast. They had one for lowering the mast. They had one for swabbing the deck, several about drinking grog, and more than a few about lost loves. But one day, they began to sing a new chanty that absolutely grated on the sugarman's nerves. You know how it is when a song gets played over and over in your head until you can't get it out, and no matter what you do, the song just keeps repeating itself until you think you're going to go bonkers? Yep, the song, which we won't repeat because we don't want anyone going bonkers, made the sugarman crazy. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't concentrate. He couldn't get the darn thing out of his head. And it didn't help that just when he thought he might get some peace from it, the pirates cranked it back up again. They even added accompaniment on the concertina, an instrument that annoys even in the best of circumstances. Finally, the sugarman couldn't stand it any longer. He stomped through the swamp until he reached the pirate hangout and grabbed several chanty men at once, swung them over his head, and flung them far and wide. Some landed in the tops of trees, some landed on the backs of alligators, and some landed in the Gulf of Mexico. The rest of the crew abandoned ship, so terrified were they of the creature as tall as a tree, with hands as wide as palmettos. Aloysius was left alone, his heart pounding faster than the flapping fins of flying fishes. The captain fell to his knees and begged for mercy. Seeing his obvious advantage, the sugarman struck a deal, which he made Aloysius write down using his own blood as ink. A deal. I, Aloysius Beaucou, and all of my heirs hereafter solemnly promise to protect the swamp and all of its critters forever, or else risk the wrath of the sugarman. Signed, A. Beaucou. P.S. Protection includes protection against a particular sea chanty. Despite his piratiness, Aloysius kept his word. He made sure that the swamp and its critters were protected. Every generation of Beaucous was forced to read the bloody deal and swear their fealty to it. After all, the big guy had spared their ancestors' life, and they were grateful. They were merciful Beaucous. Thank you.
I'm going to read a poem called Writing Ellen West. Writing Ellen West was exorcism. Exorcism of that thing within Frank that wanted, after his mother's death, to die. Inside him was that thing that he must expel from him to live. He read The Case of Ellen West as a senior in college and immediately wanted to write a poem about it, but couldn't, so he stored it, as he has stored so much that awaits existence. Unlike Ellen, he was never anorexic, but like Ellen, he was obsessed with eating and the arbitrariness of gender and having to have a body. Ellen lived out the war between the mind and the body, lived out in her body each stage of the war, its journey and progress, in which compromise, reconciliation is attempted, then rejected, then mourned, until she reaches at last, in an ecstasy costing not less than everything, death. He was grateful he was not impelled to live out the war in his body. Hiding in compromise, well wadded with art he adored, and with stupidity and distraction. The particularity inherent in almost all narrative, though contingent and exhausting, tells the story of the encounter with particularity that flesh as flesh must make. Ellen West was written in the year after his mother's death. By the time she died, he had so thoroughly betrayed the ground of intimacy on which his life was founded. He had no right to live. No use for him to tell himself that he shouldn't feel this because he felt this. He didn't think this, but he thought this. After she died, his body wanted to die, but his brain, his cunning, didn't. He likes narratives with plots that feel as if no one wills them. His mother, in her last year, revealed that she wanted him to move back to Bakersfield and teach at Bakersfield College and live down the block. He thought his mother, without knowing that this is what she wanted him to die. All he had told her in words and more than words for years was that her possessiveness and terror at his independence were wrong, wrong, wrong. He was the only person she wanted to be with, but he refused to live down the block. And then she died. It must be lifted from the mind, must be lifted and placed elsewhere, must not remain in the mind alone. Out of the 1,000 myriad voices, 1,000 myriad stories in each human head, when his mother died, there was Ellen West. This is the body that you can draw out of you to expel from you the desire to die. Give it a voice. Give each scene of her life a particularity and necessity that in Binswanger's recital are absent. Enter her skin so that you can then make her other and expel her. Survive her. Animal mind, eating the ground of Western thought, the mind-body problem. She who in the last months of her life abandoned writing poems in disgust at the failure of her poems is a poem. She in death is incarnated on a journey whose voice is the voice of her journey. Arrogance of Plutarch, of Shakespeare and Berlioz, who thought they made what Cleopatra herself could not make. Arrogance of the maker. Werther killed himself, and then young men all over Europe imitated him and killed themselves. But his author, Goethe, cunning master of praxis, lived. Frank thought when anything is made, it is made not by its likeness, not by its twin or mirror, but its opposite. Ellen, in his poem, asks, without a body, who can know himself at all? In your pajamas, you move down the stairs, just to the point where the adults couldn't yet see you, to hear more clearly the din, the sweet cacophony of adults partying. Phonograph voices among them. Phonograph voices, their magpie beauty. Sweet din, magpie beauty. One more poem, one more book in which you figure out how to make something out of not knowing enough. Thank you.
Good evening. I feel I ought to say that all you need to know is that Jane Franklin was Benjamin Franklin's sister. But what I want to say is that all you need to know is that Benjamin Franklin was Jane Franklin's brother. Her paper was made from rags, soaked and pulped and strained and dried. Her thread was made from flax, combed and spun and twisted and dyed. On a table, she laid down a sheet of foolscap and smoothed it with the palms of her hands. She creased it and folded it again. She pressed it open. With a needle made of steel, she stitched a seam. It made the slimmest of volumes, no thicker than a patch of burlap. Then she dipped the nub of a pen, slit from the feather of a bird, into a pot of ink boiled of oil mixed with soot. And on the first page, she wrote 3 words: Book of Ages. She turned the page. At the top of the next page, she began her chronicle, a book of dates. Edward Meekum, born December 1704. Jane Franklin, born on March 27, 1712. Edward Meekum married to Jane Franklin the 27th of July, 1727. The Book of Ages, her age. 15 years, 4 months. She married as a child. I hear you are grown a celebrated beauty, her brother had written to her just months before. Below the record of her marriage, she added another line. Josiah Meekum, their firstborn, Wednesday, June the 4th, 1729. She was 17. Her belly had swelled and burst, and then there were 2. The knots untied that made us one, the Boston poet Anne Bradstreet wrote about giving birth. What remains of a life? Remains means what remains of the body after death, but remains are also what remains of a person's body of work. Literary remains are unpublished papers, and remains can also mean descendants, the remains of the family line. Anne Bradstreet wrote about her children as her remains, my little babes, my dear remains. But her poems were her children too. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, she called them. Bradstreet's poems were all that her children would one day have left of her. If chance to thine eyes shall bring this verse, she told them, kiss this paper. Josiah Meekum, their firstborn, Wednesday, June the 4th, 1729, Jane had written. And below, she added another line, and died May the 18th, 1730. Her firstborn, the child of her childhood, a nursling, died 2 weeks shy of his first birthday. She counted the days of his life. A dead child is a sight no more surprising than a broken pitcher, the Boston minister Cotton Mather preached in a sermon called Right Thoughts in Sad Hours. 1 in 4 children died before the age of 10. They were kept at home, wrapped in linen, dipped in melted wax, while a box of pine was built and painted black. At the tolling of a bell, pallbearers carried the coffin to the burying ground in silence. Puritans banned prayers for the dead. There would be no words, nor, ministers warned, ought there to be tears. She washed him and kissed him and bundled him in linen and watched him being laid in the ground, the place marked with a cross made of sticks. She tried to have right thoughts. As best she could, she wept not, but she could not abide silence. The Book of Ages is a book of remembrance. She had no portraits of her children and no gravestones. Nothing remained of them except her memories and 4 sheets of foolscap stitched together. The remains of her remains. Kiss this paper. Thank you.
Hello. This takes place at a dinner party and involves a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Stanley got up and fast-forwarded the reel. His voice became a high-pitched ribbon until he lifted his finger and it quavered back down to the speed of regular talking. The great thing is, it's a buyer's market right now, his voice said from the machine. Then again, if you want to sell, it's a great time to do so. because it's a seller's market right now. Home. We say home, not house. You never hear a good agent say house. A house is where people have died on the mattresses, where pipes freeze and burst, where termites fall from the sink spigot, where somebody starts a flue fire by burning a telephone book in the furnace, where banks repossess, where mental illness takes hold. A home is something else. Do not underestimate the power in the word home. Say it, home. It's like the difference between rebel and thug. A rebel is a gleaming individual in tight Levi's, a sneering and pretty face, the kind Sal Mineo wet dreams. A thug is hairy and dark, an object that would sink to the bottom when dropped in a lake. A home is maintained, cared for, loved. The word home is savory like gravy, and like gravy, kept warm. A good realtor says home, never house, always cellar, never basement. Basements are where cats crap on old Santa costumes, where men drink themselves to death, where children learn firsthand about sexual molestation. But cellar, a cellar is where you keep root vegetables and wine. A cellar means a proximity to the earth that's not about blackness and rot, but the 4 ritual seasons. We say autumn, not fall. We say the leaves in this area are simply magnificent in autumn. We say simply magnificent, and by the way, lawn, not yard. It's underarm to armpit. Would you say armpit to a potential buyer? Say yard, and your buyer pictures rusted push mowers, planter warts, someone shearing off his thumb and a couple of fingers with a table saw. A tool shed where water-damaged pornography and used motor oil funneled into fabric softener bottles cohabitate with hints of trauma that are as dark and thick as the oil. I'm not talking about Playboy or We, harder stuff, amateur, pictorials featuring married people with their flab and bruise and smallpox vaccines, doing things to each other in rec rooms and sheds like the one housing these self-same magazines, middle-aged couples who get trashed on tequila and document with a supply of flash cubes. You have to be careful about words. You're thinking about your commission. Your hands are starting to shake at the idea of the money, and meanwhile, your client hears yard and sees himself nudging icky amateur porn with his foot. Potato bugs scattering from their damp hideout underneath. Again, it's lawn. Lawn means crew-cut grass. It means censorship, nice and wholesome. It means America, and you know what I mean by America. And by the way, cul-de-sac, not dead end. If I have to explain that, you'll never pass the exam to get your license. We say dinner, never supper. Dinner is the middle class, semi-religious, Christianesque. Dinner is a touch-tone doorbell with a little orange light glowing from within the rectangular button. The bell is there for expected guests, people carrying warm dishes covered with gingham-checked cloth. The cloth, needless to say, has been laundered with stain remover. The type of people with stained old dish rags are not going to press this doorbell. No one with a beard. No one with a grievance. Only people who share the values of the host. Thank you for having us to dinner in your lovely home. Say dinner, say home, say lawn. Don't be afraid. Like prayer, through repetition and habit, these words will begin to... Stanley had shut off the reel-to-reel machine. Thanks.
Hi, that's great. I'm back. Group 2 is going to be Young People's Literature finalists. Cynthia Kadohata, The Thing About Luck, Athenaeum Books for Young Readers, Simon & Schuster. Poetry finalist, Lucy Brock-Broido, Stay Illusion, Alfred A. Knopf. Nonfiction finalist, Wendy Lauer, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Field, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Yeah, that's my publisher. Fiction finalist, Jhumpa Lahiri, The Lowland, Alfred A. Knopf. Let's do it.
Hi. The only things you need to know are that grandmother is Obachan and Ji-chan is grandfather. I already missed my parents. I wished they were coming on harvest with us instead of our grandparents. Obachan was so much more strict than my mother or father. She told us what to eat and drink and how to live. In Japan, her family had a plum tree in their backyard. She was convinced of the healing power of umeboshi, Japanese salty plums. They're difficult to eat because they're so sour, but she ate them like candy, spitting the seeds expertly into a bowl. Spitting seeds like that would have gotten me quite a scolding, but she didn't have to use her manners anymore because she was so old. Anyway, I was required to eat 2 plums a day, and I had to wear rubber gloves whenever I did the dishes. Even at Obachan's age, she had beautiful hands. She often held them in front of herself to admire. The gloves made my hands sweaty, but if she caught me with no gloves, she would say, "Even if I ugly fish for face, someone marry me for my hands." But you had an arranged marriage, I once pointed out. No talk back or I ground you. The night before we left for harvest, my brother Jazz was really excited as we lay in bed. He had the bunk above mine. He was hoping he would make a friend this season. "Wouldn't it be great if I make 2 friends?" he said. "That would be cool," I answered. "What if I make 3? I've never had 3 friends at the same time before." Actually, he'd never had 2 friends at the same time either. One good thing about going on harvest for a few months is that there were always other kids around who belonged to drivers, custom harvesters, or farmers. I had made friends I became pen pals with, and even Jazz had made a friend one year, a boy as focused and intense as he was. I was surprised that there could be 2 such boys in the world. There were probably others as well. I wished they could all meet one another and form a club called the Intense Boys Association. Jazz became quiet then, but I knew he wasn't asleep. He was thinking about these 3 imaginary friends. I hoped he did make 3, I really did. But thinking about it made me get a small pain in my stomach, because what was more likely to happen is that he would end up alone a lot, talking to himself, playing with plastic soldiers, building with Legos, and watching movies. If you bothered him while he was playing with his soldiers, he might fly into a rage. You had to wait until he was taking a break. The hall light went on, and Ji-chan came into the bedroom. He pulled up the chair from my desk. "Tonight I tell you story of a weed," he said. "One day when I boy, I pulling weed in Orange Grove. Day hot, many weed, back hurt, bad day. Weed come all over the night before. Suddenly, more weed than I ever see. Weed my special enemy. I hate it more than anything. I have many nightmare about weed. But that day I find special weed I never see before. My mother scold me, but I take weed root carefully out, and I leave field and put my special weed in jar of water. Then after work, I plant it in wet soil. Every day I take care of that weed. It grow as tall as me, and that year we have best tasting orange crop ever. We raise price because everyone want our orange. So I want you to remember, always keep eye open for special weed. You both special weed. Oyasumi. Oyasumi nasai, Ji-chan, we said. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to read one poem, and it's 12 lines long, and it has the most brilliant title in the world. And I can say that because it's Kafka verbatim. And I always carry around titles which can provoke poems, and then I sort of import them from one to another to see if another poem will come out of it. And some of these would include another Kafka title, actually in Kafka's short story called A Cage When in Search of a Bird, or from Wallace Stevens, The Halo That Would Not Light, or Still Life with Aspirin. Sometimes Conflict with a God provokes a poem. And the one that really works all the time is just Adultery. A pygmy marmoset is the tiniest primate in the world. And this is called You Have Harnessed Yourself Ridiculously to This World. Tell the truth, I told me, when I couldn't speak. Sorrows of barbaric art, crude as a Viking ship, or a child who rode a spotted pony to the lake away from summer in the 1930s toward the iron lung of polio. According to the census, I am unmarried and unchurched, the woman in the field dressed only in the sun, too far gone to halt the Arctic cap's catastrophe, big, beautiful, blubbery white bears, each clinging to his one last hunk of ice. I am obliged now to refrain from dying for as long as it is possible. For whom left am I first? We have come to terms with ourself, like a marmoset getting out of her great ape suit. Thank you.
In the summer of 1992, I bought a plane ticket to Paris, purchased an old Renault, and drove with a friend to Kiev over hundreds of miles of bad Soviet roads. We had to stop often. The tires blew on the jagged pavement. There was no gas available, and curious peasants and truckers wanted to look under the hood to see a Western automobile engine. On the single highway stretching from Lviv to Kiev, we visited the town of Zhytomyr, a center of Jewish life in the former Pale of Settlement, which during the Second World War had become the headquarters of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust. Down the road to the south in Vinica was Adolf Hitler's werewolf compound. The entire region was once a Nazi playground in all its horror. Seeking to build an empire to last 1,000 years, Hitler arrived in this fertile area of Ukraine, the coveted breadbasket of Europe, with legions of developers, administrators, security officials, racial scientists, and engineers who were tasked with colonizing and exploiting the region. The Germans blitzkrieged eastward in 1941, ravaged the conquered territory, and evacuated westward in defeat in 1943 and 44. As the Red Army reoccupied the area, Soviet officials seized countless pages of official German reports, files of photographs and newspapers, and boxes of film reels. They deposited this war booty and classified the trophy documents in state and regional archives that would remain behind the Iron Curtain for decades. It was this material that I had come to Ukraine to read. In the archives in Zhytomyr, I discovered pages with footprints and charred edges. The documents had survived 2 assaults, a Nazi scorched earth evacuation that included the burning of incriminating evidence and the destruction of the city during the fighting. The files contained broken chains of correspondence, tattered scraps of paper with fading ink, decrees with pompous, illegible signatures left by petty Nazi officials, and police interrogation reports with the shaky scrawls of terrified Ukrainian peasants. I had seen many Nazi documents before, while comfortably ensconced in the microfilm reading room of the U.S. National Archives in Washington, D.C. But now, seated in the buildings that had been occupied by the Germans, I discovered something besides the rawness of the material I was sifting through. To my surprise, I found the names of young German women who were active in the region as Hitler's empire builders. Researching post-war investigative records, I realized that hundreds of women had been called to testify as witnesses and that many were very forthcoming. One former kindergarten teacher in Ukraine mentioned that Jewish thing during the war. She and her female colleagues had been briefed as they crossed the border from Germany into the eastern occupied zones in 1942. She remembered that a Nazi official in a gold-brownish uniform had reassured them that they should not be afraid when they heard gunfire. It was just that a few Jews were being shot. If the shooting of Jews was considered no cause for alarm during the war, then how did women respond when they actually arrived at their posts? Did they turn away, or did they want to see or do more? Hitler's Furies is based on extensive research in which I came to the conclusion that about 500,000 ordinary German women were mobilized for the war in the East. 500,000 that I call the lost generation of First World War baby boomers that consisted of teachers and nurses and secretaries and wives and mistresses. Within this mobilized mass, certain women stand out. Multitasking secretaries were both desk murderers and sadists. Some not only typed up liquidation orders, but also participated in ghetto massacres and attended mass shootings. Wives and lovers of SS men not only consoled their mates when they returned from the dirty work, but in some cases also bloodied their own hands. In Nazi thinking, rounding up and shooting Jews for several hours was hard labor, so female consolation extended beyond creating a moral sanctuary at home. Women set up refreshment tables with food and drink for their men near mass execution and deportation sites. The entanglement of sexual intimacy and violence was evident as I read the files, but in ways that were more mundane than scenes depicted in vulgar post-war pornography. Romantic outings such as a walk in the woods might bring lovers into visceral contact with the Holocaust. I read about a German commissioner and his lover secretary in Belarus who organized a winter wartime hunt. They failed to find animals, so they shot at Jewish targets who moved slowly in the snow. In many ways, Hitler's Furies is about how we fail to reckon with the past, not so much as a historical reconstruction or morality tale, but as evidence of a recurring problem, genocide, in which we all share responsibility. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for coming. I'm going to read a scene from the novel in which 2 of the principal characters are meeting for the first time. This is a scene set in Calcutta. The year is 1968, and at one point I refer to something called Naxalbari, which is an attempted Maoist revolutionary movement that begins in 1967 and by now is beginning to attract a great number of students. Normally, she stayed on the balcony reading or kept to an adjacent room as her brother and Udayan studied and smoked and drank cups of tea. Manoj had befriended him at Calcutta University, where they were both graduate students in the physics department. Much of the time, their books on the behaviors of liquids and gases would sit ignored as they talked about the repercussions of Naxalbari and commented on the day's events. The discussions strayed to the insurgencies in Indochina and in Latin American countries. In the case of Cuba, it wasn't even a mass movement, Udayan pointed out, just a small group attacking the right targets. All over the world, students were gaining momentum, standing up to exploitative systems. It was another example of Newton's second law of motion, he joked. Force equals mass times acceleration. Manush was skeptical. What could they, urban students, claim to know about peasant life? Nothing, Udayan said. We need to learn from them. Through an open doorway, she saw him, tall but slight of build, 23 but looking a bit older. His clothing hung on him loosely. He wore kurtas, but also European-style shirts, irreverently, the top portion unbuttoned, the bottom untucked, the sleeves rolled back past the elbow. He sat in the room where they listened to the radio, on the bed that served as a sofa where, at night, Gauri slept. His arms were lean, his fingers too long for the small porcelain cups of tea her family served him, which he drained in just a few gulps. His hair was wavy, the brows thick, the eyes languid and dark. His hand seemed an extension of his voice, always in motion, embellishing the things he said. Even as he argued, he smiled easily. His upper teeth overlapped slightly, as if there were one too many of them. From the beginning, the attraction was there. He never said anything to Gauri if she happened to brush by, never glancing, never acknowledging that she was Manush's younger sister, until the day the houseboy was out on an errand and Manush asked Gauri if she minded making them some tea. She could not find a tray to put the teacups on. She carried them in, nudging open the door to the room with her shoulder. Looking up at her an instant longer than he needed to, Udayan took the cup from her hands. The groove between his mouth and nose was deep, clean-shaven. Still looking at her, he posed his first question. "Where do you study?" he asked. Because she went to Presidency and Calcutta University was just next door, she searched for him on the quadrangle and among the bookstalls, at the tables of the coffee house if she went there with a group of friends. Something told her he did not go to his classes as regularly as she did. She began to watch for him from the generous balcony that wrapped around the two sides of her grandparents' flat, overlooking the intersection where Cornwallis Street began. It became something for her to do. Then one day she spotted him, amazed that she knew which of the hundreds of dark heads was his. He was standing on the opposite corner, buying a pack of cigarettes. Then he was crossing the street, a cotton book bag over his shoulder, glancing both ways, walking toward their flat. She crouched below the filigree, under the clothes drying on the line, worried that he would look up and see her. 2 minutes later, she heard footsteps climbing the stairwell, and then the rattle of the iron knocker on the door of the flat. She heard the door being opened, the houseboy letting him in. It was an afternoon. Everyone, including Manush, happened to be out, and she'd been reading alone. She wondered if he'd turned back, given that Manush wasn't there. Instead, a moment later, he stepped out onto the balcony. "No one else here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Will you talk to me then?" The laundry was damp. Some of her petticoats and blouses were clipped to the line. The material of the blouses was tailored to the shape of her upper torso, her breasts. He unclipped one of the blouses and put it further down the line to make room. He did this slowly, a mild tremor in his fingers forcing him to focus more than another person might on the task. Standing beside him, she was aware of his height, the slight stoop in his shoulders, the angle at which he held his face. He struck a match against the side of a box and lit a cigarette, cupping his whole hand over his mouth when he drew the cigarette to his lips. The houseboy brought out biscuits and tea. They overlooked the intersection from 4 flights above. They stood beside one another, both of them leaning into the railing. Together, they took in the stone buildings with their decrepit grandeur that lined the streets, their tired columns, their crumbling cornices, their sullied shades. Her face was supported by the discreet barrier of her hand. His arm hung over the edge. The burning cigarette was in his fingers. The sleeves of his Punjabi were rolled up, exposing the veins running from his wrist to the crook of the elbow. They were prominent, the blood in them greenish-gray, like a pointed archway below the skin. There was something elemental about so many human beings in motion at once, walking, sitting in buses and trams, pulling or being pulled along in rickshaws. On the other side of the street, there were a few gold and silver shops, all in a row, with mirrored walls and ceilings, always crowded with families, endlessly reflected, placing orders for wedding jewels. There was the press where they took their clothes to be ironed, the store where Gauri bought her ink, her notebooks, narrow sweet shops where trays of confections were studded with flies. The panwala sat cross-legged at one corner under a bare bulb, spreading white lime paste on stacks of betel leaves. A traffic constable stood at the center in his helmet on his little box, blowing a whistle and waving his arms. The clamor of so many motors, of so many scooters and lorries and buses and cars filled their ears. "I like this view," he said. Thank you.
All right. We're on to group 3 now. And after group 3, there'll be a 5-minute intermission. Yeah? So, something to consider. Group 3, Young People's Literature finalist. Tom McNeill, Far, Far Away. Knopf Books for Young Readers, Random House. Poetry finalist, Adrian Matika, The Big Smoke, Penguin Group, USA. Nonfiction finalist, George Packer, The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Fiction finalist, James McBride, The Good Lord Bird, Riverhead, a division of Penguin Group, USA. Yeah.
It's very nice to be here tonight. Far, Far Away, the protagonist, when the book begins, is 14 years old. But when he was 6 or 7, he made the mistake of letting a friend know that he hears voices. He calls it a strange whispering, and if he presses his temple, he can hear the voices more clearly. It's a small town, and people believe different things, that he's too suggestible, that maybe he's picking up a distant radio station through a silver tooth filling. But mostly they just think that Jeremy is strange and that he does not hear voices. In fact, he does hear voices, and one of the voices he hears is the voice of Jakob Grimm, who presumptuously enough is the narrator of this book. So I'm going to read a bit. As a mortal man, I was known as Jakob Grimm. Yes, the very one. With my younger brother, Wilhelm, I lived once in Germany, in the village of Steinau in the kingdom of Hesse. Both of us were linguists, but our collection of household stories, fairy tales, as they are now commonly called, is what you doubtless know. I have been dead since the Saturday afternoon in September 1863 when I saw the elm tree in the garden dissolve into nothing. and also the window before which I sat, and the wicker chair, and my niece, who had just inquired what I, lieber Onkel, would like for tea. I lay with a dead tongue and a dead right hand. The next day, I stopped breathing. In death, I expected to be greeted by Wilhelm, who had died before me. All of our lives, my brother and I played and studied and worked as one. He was less sturdy than I and often unwell. I forgave him that. But his was a dreamer's nature, and he was given to wistful song, longings to travel, matters of the heart, the studies, I would say, the studies, the studies, the studies. If he came reluctantly to the work, still he came. We were strapped to the same yoke. Our desks stood side to side. When Wilhelm married, I joined his household. So, of course, in death, we would travel together. Was I so foolish to believe that? But here I was, and Wilhelm was not to be found. I set out to look for him. I asked the dead if they had seen my brother, but the dead who remain here are less numerous than you might imagine. Two here, one there, that sort of thing. I met an ancient specter who now inhabited the kitchen space of a grand home where she had served as a maid. She had hollow eyes and a strange smile. I inquired of her, and she asked if my brother had been satisfied with his life. Yes, I said, of course. My brother was a romantic man, and his work, his wife, and his children had met all of his romantic expectations. For all of his days, he had been at ease with his life. Then maybe he has passed on, said the maid. Her hollow eyes stared fully at me. Very few do not pass on. It was she who explained to me that only the troubled remain here in the Vision-Raum. Those who are agitated and uneasy, still looking for what this maid and others since have called the thing undone. Vengeance, for example, she told me, and then, eyeing me slyly, or some other unknown yet unmet desire. It is unique to every ghost, tailored to his own failures, disenchantments, or regrets. The dead maid set her hollow eyes on me. It all depends on you. These phrases, the thing undone, unknown yet unmet desire, have caused me lingering unrest. But allow me to speak now of the Zwischenraum itself. Examine, if you will, the vibrating space around you, what is between and around your hands and your hearths and your homes. This is where I, or another like me, might be, in the space between. Specters are not, as often imagined, agents of physical change. We cannot move tables or cause knockings in walls. There is about us a slight drafting of warm air. Perhaps you have occasionally had one of us pass near you and, feeling a subtle current of warmth, wondered what it was. With effort, we can use this drafting to move a paper, or with greater concentration, perhaps even cause a door to swing closed. But more than that is beyond us. Here is what we can and cannot do in the Vision-Raum. We see but cannot touch. We smell but cannot taste. We suffer but cannot weep. We hasten but cannot fly. We rest but cannot sleep. We speak but are not heard. So, and what of Jeremy Johnson Johnson, who heard me? He was one of the exceptionals. Thank you.
Peace, everybody. It is so great to be here. I'm grateful for you listening, too. I'm going to read 3 short poems, and they're all in the voice of Jack Johnson. I'd like to give you just a quick overview of Mr. Johnson so that I don't have to stop in between the poems. He was the first African-American heavyweight champion. He won in 1908. He beat a guy named Tommy Burns, who ducked and dodged him for about 2 years before finally agreeing to fight him. His parents were slaves, so he's the first generation after emancipation, and his favorite author was Shakespeare. Battle Royale. Back then, they'd chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck won't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wildcats alike. And since most creatures are naturally afraid of bears, there wouldn't always be much of a show in the bear garden. So the handler sometimes put the bear's eyes out or took his teeth to make the fight more sporting. I believe you need eyes more than you need teeth in a fight, but losing either makes a bear a little less mean. Once baiting was against the law, some smart somebody figured coloreds would fight just as hard if hungry enough. So they rounded up the skinniest of us, had us stripped to trousers, then blindfolded us before the fight. They turned us in hard circles a few times on the ring steps like a motor car engine before pushing us between the ropes. When the bell rang, it felt like I got hit from 8 directions, and I didn't know where those punches came from, but I swung so hard my shoulder hadn't been right since, because the man said only the last darky on his feet gets a meal. Gold smile. It's got an epigraph from Shakespeare. Teeth hadst thou in thy head when thou was born, to signify thou camest to bite the world. It's from Henry VI. I should probably mention right now that Jack Johnson had gold teeth. I guess that would help. Gold smile. They call teeth dent in France, and the name makes sense the way teeth do what they do to bacon and shoulders and cakes. The French word for gold is or, so when the folks in Paris describe my smile, it sounds like what happens when I punch a door. Dent's door. Dent's door, the French children say when I open wide. Dent's door, Etta says when she locks herself in the powder room. Tommy Burns said Dent's door when I was hooking him into asking for forgiveness. His people back in Canada would have said the same exact thing if they were in Sydney to witness our spectacle. Before we got into the ring, I told Tommy the only reason I got these gold uppers was to make every bite of my food twice as expensive. This is the last one. It's called Il Trovatore. Jack Johnson's favorite opera was Verdi's piece. Il Trovatore. The first time I heard the aria, it was like sunup after the great storm. The woman's voice rising, then rising more, as if the one of it all wouldn't allow her another breath. Like road work when you've punched yourself out. Like Tommy Burns catching my gut hook. Like the first I saw of Etta. Like the sound of the crowd in Reno going wild when Jeffries couldn't go on. Like going up the steps to the Café de Champion with the crash of gunshots in Etta's rooms. Like finding Etta on the floor with a halo of blood getting bigger by the minute. Like the nurses not nursing but crying and pointing at the gun still hot in Etta's own hand. Like realizing Etta's still breathing, whispering a libretto on the heels of her last breath. You did this, Papa. You did this. Thank you.
Dean Price owned a chain of truck stops and fast food restaurants in the dying tobacco and textile region of rural North Carolina. His businesses began to fail with the recession, and in the middle of that he had a kind of epiphany, which was that he should use the fallow land all around him to grow canola and use the canola to make biodiesel instead of selling imported diesel. At this moment that I'll read from, he hasn't quite had that epiphany yet, but he's close. A 2-lane asphalt road ran past the woods, white oak, shagbark hickory, Carolina ash. And in the shadows of the trees, a tobacco barn was year by year collapsing on itself, the metal roof sloping inward, pieces of bare siding hanging loose from nails. Nearby, a white clapboard house with empty windows squatted at the roadside, half smothered in tree branches and vines, while a fire-scorched, handwritten sign on the outside wall still advertised crush. Farther along, the road took a turn, and a tidy brick ranch house with a big satellite dish mounted on top stood in the golden sunlight of a red-brown field. Another bend, a gentle hill, deep woods again, then an abandoned metal warehouse alone in a clearing. The road straightened and flattened and came to a stoplight where a pair of strip malls faced each other, parking lots full, a Walgreens across from a McDonald's, Shell opposing BP. Another light, a shuttered car dealership, a vast scrapyard with a mountain of twisted metal and stacked timbers next door to a spinning mill that was being methodically gutted like a great whale and sold off one part at a time. Then downtown, the lonely little Main Street, a taekwondo studio, a government benefits office, a closed restaurant, a nameless corner store for rent, 2 pedestrians in 4 blocks, a Dollar General that marked the far end of town. On the other side, the country opened up at once, the road passing fields, corn planted on one, nothing on the next, weeds and clods of dirt. Then a residential development with the 2-story look-alike houses in neat rows laid out across someone's former tobacco farm. And beyond the subdivision, isolated on acres of grass, behind a split-rail fence and a man-made lake, the supersized faux chateau of a celebrity NASCAR driver. The landscape Dean had returned to, where he planned to live out his life, was very old and also new, as particular as anything in America and also as generic, as beautiful and as ugly. In his imagination, it had become a nightmare, so profoundly wrong that he called it sinful, and he hated the sin more than any casual visitor or distant critic possibly could. Yet he also saw here a dream of redemption so unlikely and glorious that it could only fill the mind's eye of a visionary native son. Once driving through Cleveland County, Dean happened to pass the Hardshell Baptist Church that his father had once tried to get but failed, the failure that had broken his father's will. Dean had gone down with his father to Cleveland County and heard the sermon that he'd given for his audition back around 1975, so that decades later, he recognized the church. And he also noticed that there was now a fucking Bojangles right next door. For Dean, Bojangles had come to represent everything that was wrong with the way Americans lived, how they raised their food and transported it across the country, how they grew the crops to feed the animals they ate, the way they employed the people who worked in the restaurants, the way the money left the community. Everything about it was wrong. Dean's own business, gas and fast food, had become hateful to him, and he saw the error of his ways as his father never had, and the conjunction of his father's legacy and his own struck him with bitter irony as he drove past. He was seeing beyond the surfaces of the land to its hidden truths. Some nights, he sat up late on his front porch with a glass of Jack and listened to the trucks heading south on 220, carrying crates of live chickens to the slaughterhouses, always under cover of darkness, like a vast and shameful trafficking. Chickens pumped full of hormones that left them too big to walk. And he thought how these same chickens might return from their destination as pieces of meat to his floodlit Bojangles up the hill from his house. And that meat would be drowned in the bubbling fryers by employees whose hatred of the job would leak into the cooked food. And that food would be served up and eaten by customers who would grow obese and end up in the hospital in Greensboro with diabetes or heart failure, a burden to the public. And later, Dean would see them riding around the Mayodan Walmart in electric carts because they were too heavy to walk the aisles of a supercenter, just like hormone-fed chickens. Thank you.
You liked me. You really liked me. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very nice to see so many nice people here today. I really feel very nice today. The Good Lord Bird is the memoir of a 103-year-old black man who claimed to have served with the great abolitionist John Brown. He had to pretend to be a girl to do it. I was born a colored man, and don't you forget it. But I lived as a colored woman for 17 years. My pa was a full-blooded Negro out of Osawatomie in Kansas Territory, north of Fort Scott, near Lawrence. Pa was a barber by trade, though that never gave him full satisfaction. Preaching the gospel was his main line. Pa ministered most of the lowlifes, four-flushers, slaveholders, and drunks who came along the Kansas Trail. He weren't a big man in size, but he dressed big. He favored a top hat, pants that drawed up around his ankles, high-collar shirt, and heeled boots. Most of his clothing was junk he found or items he stole off dead folks on the prairie who killed off from fever or aired out on account of some dispute or other. His shirt had bullet holes in it the size of quarters. His hat was 2 sizes too small. His trousers come from 2 different pairs, colored pairs sewn together in the middle, right where the arse met. His hair was nappy enough to strike a match on. Most women wouldn't go near him, including my ma, who closed her eyes in death, bringing me to this life. She was said to be a gentle, high yellow woman. Your ma was the only woman in the world man enough to hear my holy thoughts, Pa boasted, for I am a man of many parts. Whatever them parts was, they didn't add up to much. For all full up and dressed to the nines, complete with boots and 3-inch top hat, Pa only came out to about 4 feet 8 inches tall. And quite a bit of that was air. But what he lacked in size, Pa made up for with his voice. My pa could out-yell with his voice any white man who ever walked God's green earth, bar none. He had a high, thin voice. When he talked, it sounded like he had a Jew's harp stuck down his throat, for he spoke in pops and bangs and such, which meant speaking with him was a 2-for-1 deal, being that he cleaned your face and spit-washed it for you at the same time. Make that 3-for-1 when you consider his breath. His breath smelled like hog guts and sawdust, for he worked in a slaughterhouse for many years, so most colored folks avoided him generally. Dutch Henry's Tavern sat right near the Missouri border. It served as a kind of post office, courthouse, rumor mill, and gin house for Missouri rebels who come across the Kansas line to drink, throw cards, tell lies, frequent whores, and holler to the moon about niggers taking over the world and the white man's constitutional rights being thrown in the outhouse by the Yankees and so forth. I paid no attention to that talk, for my aim in them days was to shine shoes while my pa cut hair and shove as much Johnny cake and ale down my little red lane as possible. But come spring, talk in Dutch circled around a certain murderous white scoundrel named Old John Brown, a Yank from back east who come to Kansas Territory to stir up trouble with his gang of sons called the Potawatomi Rifles. To hear them tell it, Old John Brown and his murderous sons planned to deaden every man, woman, and child on the prairie. Old John Brown stole horses. Old John Brown burned homesteads. Old John Brown raped women and hacked off heads. Old John Brown done this, and Old John Brown done that. And why, by God, by the time they was done with him, Old John Brown sounded like the most onerous, murderous, low-down son of a bitch you ever saw. And I resolved that if I was ever to run across him, why, by God, I would do him in myself, just on account of what he done or was gonna do to the good white people I knowed. Well, not long after I decided them proclamations, an old tottering Irishman teetered into Dutch Henry's and sat in Pa's barber's chair. Weren't nothing special about him. There was 100 prospecting prairie bums wandering around Kansas Territory in them days looking for a lift west or a job rustling cattle. This drummer weren't nothing special. He was a stooped, skinny fella, fresh off the prairie, smelling like buffalo dung with a nervous twitch in his jaw and a chin full of ragged whiskers. His face had so many lines and wrinkles running between his mouth and his eyes that if you bundle them up, you could make them a canal. His thin lips was pulled back to a permanent frown. His coat, vest, pants, and string tie looked like mice had chewed on every corner of him, and his boots was altogether done in. His toes stuck clean through the toe points. He was a sorry-looking package altogether, even by prairie standards, but he was white. So when he sat in Pa's chair for a haircut and a shave, Pa put a bib on him and went to work. As usual, Pa worked the top end, and I done the bottom, shining his boots, which in this case was more toes than leather. After a few minutes, the Irishman glanced around and seeing as nobody was standing too close, said to Pa quietly, "Are you a Bible man?" Well, Pa was a lunatic when it came to God, and that perked him right up. He said, "Why, boss, I surely is. I knows all kinds of Bible verses." The old coot smiled. I can't say it was a real smile, for his face was so stern it weren't capable of smiling, but his lips kind of widened out. The mention of the Lord clearly pleased him, and it should have, for he was running on the Lord's grace right then and there. For that was the murderer, old John Brown himself, the scourge of Kansas territory, sitting right there in Dutch's Tavern with a $1,500 reward on his head and half the population in Kansas territory aiming to put a charge in him. Thank you.
We're on to group 4. We've got 2 groups left. And group 4 is Young People's Literature finalist Meg Rosoff, Picture Me Gone, G.P. Putnam's Sons, Penguin Group USA. Poetry finalist Matt Rasmussen, Black Aperture, Louisiana State University Press. Nonfiction finalist Alan Taylor, The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, W.W. Norton and Company. And, we're going to get to meet Thomas Pynchon. Just kidding. Reading for Thomas Pynchon will be Jeannie Berlin, The Bleeding Edge, Penguin Press. Let's do it, yeah.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We're in a motel in upstate New York with 2 English adults, an English child, and a dog. I don't recognize the man who opens the door, but Honey does. She bounds at him, launching herself through the air like a missile. "Darling Honey," I hear him say, laughing, his voice cracked with emotion. "Darling dog." Honey is incandescent with joy, ecstatic, and it's contagious. If I had a tail, I'd wag it too. At last. Matthew buries his head in her thick white ruff. He holds her face in his hands, and his tired features fill with light. At last he stands up and embraces my father. Their faces disappear, and the 2 men seem to merge. They could be twins, so similar are they in height and stature. I can imagine them as children, or on the side of a mountain, the closest either had to a brother. Honey stands looking up at her master, alert to every expression, every inch electric with love. She has lost the melancholic expression of the last few days. Matthew cannot resist kneeling again, and she licks his face and neck till he grasps her head in his 2 hands and pushes her gently away. Not content to step back, she turns sideways and rubs the length of her body across his chest, first one way, then the other. If she could eat him, she would. Matthew has strong features and unnaturally intense eyes. His hair is thick and gray. Even I can see that despite his age, he is handsome. He doesn't attempt hugging or kissing, just looks at me, his head tilted slightly, watching. It is hard to get over the habit of dislike that has grown in my head, but Matthew is not what I expected. His expression is complex. He looks athletic, but holds his shoulders stiffly, as if in pain. I wish now that I hadn't sent him those texts. While he speaks to Gil, I examine his face. There are purple shadows under his eyes. He smells clean and is recently shaved. He wears a faded green flannel shirt. I expected desperation, but instead he is quiet and reserved. It is impossible to ignore the fact that he looks unspeakably sad. We sit down, me on the bed, Gil and Matthew in chairs. Matthew asks Gil if he wants a drink, doesn't wait for an answer, and pours wine into 2 glasses. I don't need to check my watch. It's not yet 10 in the morning. Gil looks ill at ease. When I tune into my father, the signals all line up. Is this because I know him so well or because he has nothing left to hide? I get no signal from Matthew. What little comes through is scribbly and erratic. Everything scrambled is not the same as a lack of information. It suggests interference. Matthew's signals are blocked, as if he has a glass wall buried a few inches beneath his skin. He is accustomed to hiding. It is obvious that they would like to talk without me present, but I am not in a mood to cooperate. I sit absolutely still, waiting for resolution. Matthew drinks with steady deliberation and pours another. They make small talk about our trip. Gil tells him about Linda and Jake. Matthew listens quietly, asking questions that may or may not mask a depth of emotional involvement. The mood in the room becomes increasingly odd. Honey searches Matthew's face. I do too, and am abashed suddenly to feel that I may be contributing to his unhappiness. Just as I'm trying to figure out how to excuse myself, Matthew asks if I would mind sitting in the lobby for a bit while they talk. He asks politely, as to a social and intellectual equal. I appreciate this. It is not commonly the way people speak to children. Gil takes me out to the lobby, which has been designed as a pretend study, with a desk, an ugly red leather sofa, a lamp, a bookshelf filled with paperback books. Strange snow light pours in through the window. No one sits in the reception area, which connects to a small office. Gil kisses the top of my head and apologizes for, well, he says, for everything. Perguntadora, he says. I'm busy collecting my things and only turn to him after a minute. Yes? Forgive me, he says. I'm trying to do what's best for everyone. I stare at him, studying his face. You didn't have to lie to me. I know, he says. I'm not an idiot. Far from it. But everyone alive has secrets, he says. It's terrible being a keeper of secrets. Worse, maybe, than being kept in the dark. I say nothing. Mila, I need your help. Like he needs to point that out. Our eyes meet again, and suddenly I feel grubby and false. I'm withholding help because it is the only power I have, except the power to be kind. I reach over and take his hand, the one that is not gripping his suitcase, and so the drama between us melts away. Who knows? Someday I may need him to lie for me. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. I'm really nervous. My book of poems is about my brother's suicide when I was 16 and he was 19. And the following two poems deal with that. Excuse me. Outgoing. Our answering machine still played your message. And on the day you died, Dad asked me to replace it. I was chosen to save us the shame of dead you answering calls. Hello, I've just shot myself. To leave a message for me, call hell. The clear cassette lay inside the white machine, like a tiny patient being monitored, or a miniature glass briefcase protecting the scroll of lost voices. Everything barely mattered, and then no longer did. I pressed record and laid my voice over yours, muting it forever, and even now. I'm sorry we are not here, I began. And this is my second and final poem. It's titled Reverse Suicide. The guy Dad sold your car to comes back to get his money, leaves the car. With filthy rags, we rub it down until it doesn't shine and wipe your blood into the seams of the seat. Each snowflake stirs before lifting into the sky as I learn you won't be dead. The unsuffering ends when the mess of your head pulls together around a bullet in your mouth. You spit it into Dad's gun before arriving in the driveway, while the evening brightens and we pour bag after bag of leaves on the lawn, waiting for them to leap onto the bare branches. Thank you.
It's an honor to speak to such a full house. It's not a common experience when your topic is the War of 1812. Once, some very optimistic organizers in Philadelphia booked me into a room with 900 seats. And 40 people showed up and arranged themselves randomly through the 900 seats. The following comes from the start of The Internal Enemy. And that was a phrase that Southerners used to describe the slaves in their midst. And in wartime, they particularly feared that they would face a combination of an external enemy and an internal enemy. One night in October 1814, on the Virginia shore of the Potomac River, several young enslaved men stole a canoe and paddled across the river to Laidlow's Ferry on the Maryland shore. Abandoning the canoe, they took the larger ferry boat, for they needed a craft big enough to carry away 17 people. Returning to the Virginia shore, the men retrieved wives and children for a dash down the river to seek a British warship as their portal to freedom. In the morning, their masters discovered that their slaves were gone, and in the words of one witness, quote, had taken many articles out of Mr. Abraham Huey's dwelling house in the course of the night, and all their own articles and effects out of their own houses, end quote. Armed white men rowed a swift boat in pursuit down the river, but in vain, for the former slaves had reached the warship. 5.5 years later, the leader of the escape wrote a letter to his former master, Huey. In October of 1814, Bartlett Shanklin had been a prized blacksmith, 35 years old and worth $800, the most valuable of the runaways. In May 1820, he was thriving as a free man in Preston, a township near Halifax in Nova Scotia, and he wanted Huey to know it. And now I quote the letter. "Sir, I take this opportunity of writing these lines to inform you how I am situated here. I have a shop and set of tools of my own and am doing very well. When I was with you, you treated me very ill. And for that reason, I take the liberty of informing you that I'm doing as well as you, if not better. When I was with you, I worked very hard, and you neither gave me money nor any satisfaction. But since I have been here, I am able to make gold and silver as well as you. The night that Coakley stopped me, he was very strong, but I showed him that subtlety was far preferable to strength, and brought away others with me who, thank God, are all doing well. So I remain, Bartlett Shanklin. P.S. My love to all my friends. I hope they are doing well." As a free man, Shanklin could at last make his own money. Enslaved people in Virginia were third and fourth generation Americans who knew the social value of a dollar as a measure of a man's merit. Indeed, the runaway had become a better man than the master, who had treated him so very ill by keeping him down, for Shanklin's prosperity did not rely on enslaving others. Coakley was apparently a powerful man, perhaps an overseer, who tried to restrain Shanklin on the eve of the escape. But the clever blacksmith had outwitted the foe to lead family and friends to freedom. Slavery had taught the value and the ways of subtlety to the enslaved, who had to mask their knowledge and resistance. Rather than destroy the rebuking letter, Huey showed more greed than pride by submitting it as evidence in a bid for post-war compensation from the federal government. Huey's choice preserved Shanklin's words for you to hear tonight. Thank you.
I am not Thomas Pynchon, but I'm going to read a passage that he selected. It takes place at a big party called Geeks Cotillion down in Soho the weekend before September 11th. God help us. How sleazy is it? How has it come to this? A rented palace, a denial of the passage of time, a mogul on the black diamond slopes of the IT sector thinks he's a rock star. It isn't so much that Maxine can't be fooled. It's more that she hates to be. And when she finds anybody trying too hard to fool her, she reaches for her revolver. Or in this case, turns and heads for the stairs, leaving Felix and Gabriel Ice to schmooze as they will, rogue to rogue. Does Nora Charles ever have to put up with this sort of thing? Even Nancy Drew. The parties they go to, it's all catered hors d'oeuvres and beautiful strangers, but let Maxine try to step out and enjoy herself a little. Forget it. It always ends up like this. Weekday-type obligations, guilt, ghosts. For some reason, however, she manages to stay out all night and close the joint down. Horst, perhaps from secondhand smoke, regressing to his old party animal ways, is affably all over the place. Maxine finds herself tangled in and presently refereeing nerd disputes she can't understand a word of. She nods out in the toilet once or twice. And if she dreams at all, it's hard to separate from the great invisible wheeling around her, decelerating, board fading to all but silent black and white, till it's that time at last to CD Tilde home. For recessional music, there's Closing Time by Semisonic, a 4-chord farewell to the old century. Former and future nerdistocracy slowly, and to look at them, you'd think reluctantly, filtering back out onto the street, into the long September which has been with them in a virtual way since spring before last, continuing only to deepen. Putting their street faces back on for it, faces already under silent assault, as if by something ahead, some Y2K of the work week that no one is quite imagining. The crowds drifting slowly out into the little legendary streets, the highs beginning to dissipate, out into the casting off of veils before the luminosities of dawn, a sea of T-shirts nobody's reading, a clamor of messages nobody's getting, as if it's the true text history of Nights in the Alley, outcries to be attended to and not to be lost. The 3 a.m. Cosmo deliveries to code sessions and all-night shredding parties, the bedfellows who came and went, the bands in the clubs, the songs whose hooks still wait to ambush in an idle hour, the day jobs with meetings about meetings and bosses without clue, the unreal strings of zeros and business models changing from 1 minute to the next, the startup parties every night of the week and more on Thursdays than you can keep track of. Which of these faces, so claimed by the time, the epic whose end they've been celebrating all night, which of them can see ahead among the microclimates of binary tracking earthwide, everywhere, through dark fiber and twisted pairs, and nowadays wirelessly, through spaces, private and public, anywhere, among cyber sweatshop needles flashing and never still, in that unquiet, vastly stitched and unstitched tapestry they have all sat at some time growing crippled in the service of, to the shape of the day imminent. A procedure waiting execution, about to be revealed, a search result with no instructions on how to look for it. In the taxi on the way home, there's loud traffic in Arabic on the radio, which Maxine figures at first for a call-in show, till the cabbie picks up a handset and joins in. She glances at the ID up on the plexiglass. The face in the photo is too indistinct to make out, but the name is Islamic, Mohammed somebody. It's like hearing a party from another room, though Maxine notices there's no music, no laughing. High emotion, all right, but closer to tears or anger. Men talking over each other, shouting, interrupting. A couple of voices might be women's, though later it will seem they could have belonged to high-pitched men. The only word Maxine recognizes, and she hears it more than once, is Insha'Allah, Arabic for whatever Horst nods. They're waiting at a light. If it is God's will, the driver corrects him. half turning in his seat so that Maxine happens to be looking him in the face. What she sees there will keep her from getting to sleep right away, or that's how she'll remember it. Thank you.
And we have arrived at group 5. Young People's Literature finalist Jean Luan Yang, Boxers and Saints, 1st, 2nd Macmillan. Poetry finalist Mary Shebist, Incarnadine, Grey Wolf Press. Nonfiction finalist Going Clear, Scientology, Hollywood, and the Prison of Belief, Alfred A. Knopf. Fiction finalist George Saunders, 10th of December, Random House. And it's the last one, guys, so enjoy it.
Thank you so much for being here. Boxers and Saints is a 2-volume graphic novel about the Boxer Rebellion, which is a war that was fought on Chinese soil in the year 1900. I examine the war from both sides, so the antagonists of one book are the protagonists of the other. I'm going to be reading to you the beginning of the 2nd volume, Saints. I am my mother's 4th daughter, born on the 4th day of the 4th month, and the only one of her children to survive past a year. When my mother approached her father-in-law for my name, he refused. 4, after all, is a homonym of death, and grandfather had had enough of death. Eventually, the family took to calling me by my birth order. 4 girl, what took so long? No more dilly-dallying. 4 girl, yes, mother, death girl. My earliest memory is not of playing or laughing or crying, but wanting. I desperately wanted grandfather to like me. My oldest cousin Chung was his favorite. Chung was tall and handsome. Chung could chop the thickest log in half with a single swing of his axe. Amazing, clap, clap, whack. Often, grandfather would share a drink with him. If only I could do the same, I thought, grandfather would like me. He would share a drink with me and maybe even give me a proper name. One morning, or perhaps it was so early that it was still night, I woke up before the water had to be fetched and the chickens tended. I set my mind to practicing. Whack, 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 whack. By the time the sun came up, my hands were so slick with sweat and swollen with pain that they no longer felt like my own. They were Chung's hands now. I was sure of it. They would be able to do what Chung's hands could do. 4 girl, where have you been, ungrateful child? You leave all this work for me to do on my own? Ma, where's grandfather? I want to show him something. Grandfather doesn't have time for your foolishness. Stop dilly-dallying and come help. Will you come look then, please? What is this, 4 girl? Just watch, Ma. You know what? This log is too small. Give me a minute. What is going on out here? It seems that my daughter has become a wood chopping expert. No kidding. All right, I'm ready. Go, 4 girl. Don't encourage her. Swing, miss. Slip, crash. Father-in-law, are you all right? Crumble, crumble. Who did this to Tu Di Gong? What have I told you about this one? Father-in-law, please, don't let her upset you like this. She is a foolish girl. I will punish her. I will punish her severely. That girl is a devil. A devil. A devil. Alone in the woods, I prayed for death. Lord Yama, please take me from this world. For my sins, take me now. Take me. Take me. Take me already. Crunch, crunch. Lord Yama? You dumb old raccoon, you're no Lord Yama. Death is fierce and beautiful, while you are small and mangy. Dig, dig. That carcass has probably been there for days. Don't tell me you're going to. Disgusting. Nom, nom, nom. As I watched him eat that night, I had a revelation. Despite being the most wretched of animals, old raccoon didn't shed a tear. He knew his place in the world and accepted it. That night, I resolved to do the same. And that was how I embraced my devil self. It took me hours to perfect my devil face, but I finally did. I wore it whenever I was around other people to warn them that they were in the presence of evil. After all, being a devil does not excuse one from common courtesy. Thank you.
My book moves through a variety of reimaginings of the iconic Annunciation scene between Mary and the angel Gabriel. This poem's occasion happened a few years ago when a mother in Portland, Oregon, threw her 2 children off the Selwood Bridge in the middle of the night, a few stones' throw from where I was sleeping. I think of this scene as a foil, a kind of foil to the Annunciation. This is so and so descending from the bridge. It is so, and not the dusty world who drops. It is their mother, and not the dusty world who drops them. Why I imagine her so often empty-handed as the houseboat's distant lights rise and fall on the far ripples, I do not know. I know that darkness, have stood on that bridge in the space between the streetlights, dizzy with looking down. Maybe some darks are deep enough to swallow what we want them to. But you can't have 2 worlds in your hands and choose emptiness. I think that she will never sleep as I sleep, I who have no so-and-so to throw or mourn or to let go. But in that once, with no more mine, this little so and that one, she is what out-nights me, so close, so called crazy little mother who does not jump. I think a lot about what it means to love well and how we fail at it and how those failings sometimes prompt us to imagine something beyond human love. This is invitation.
If I can believe in air, I can believe in the angels of air. Angels, come breathe with me. Angel of abortion, angel of alchemy, angels of barrenness and bliss, exhale closer. Let me feel your breath on my teeth. I call to you, angels of embryos, earthquakes, you of forgetfulness. Angels of infection, cover my mouth and nose with your mouth. Failed inventions, tilt my head back. Angels of prostitution and rain, you of sheerness and sorrow, you who take nothing, breathe into me. You who have cleansed your lips with fire, I do not need to know your faces. I do not need you to have faces. Angels of water insects, let me sleep to the sound of your breathing. You without lungs, make my chest rise. Without you, my air tastes like nothing. For you, I hold my breath. Thanks.
There are two characters that I'm going to refer to here, both writers. One is Paul Haggis, who is a two-time Academy Award-winning writer and director who was in Scientology for 34 years. And the other is L. Ron Hubbard, who was the founder of Scientology, and incidentally, as a writer, he holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the number of titles by any one author, more than 1,000. Would write 100,000 words a month, so give you something to aspire to. If nothing else, this book is a testament to the damage that writers can do. Like every Scientologist, when Haggis entered the church, he took his first steps into the mind of L. Ron Hubbard. He read about Hubbard's adventurous life, how he wandered the world, led dangerous expeditions, and healed himself of crippling war injuries through the techniques that he developed into Dianetics. He was not a prophet like Muhammad or divine like Jesus. He had not been visited by an angel bearing tablets of revelation like Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. Scientologists believe that Hubbard discovered the existential truths that form their doctrine through extensive research. In that way, it is science. The apparent rationalism appealed to Haggis. He had long since walked away from the religion of his upbringing, but he was still looking for a way to express his idealism. It was important to him that Scientology didn't demand belief in a God. But the figure of L. Ron Hubbard did hover over the religion in suggestive ways. He wasn't worshipped exactly, but his visage and name were everywhere, like the absolute ruler of a small kingdom. There seemed to be two Hubbards within the church, the godlike authority whose every word was regarded as scripture, and the avuncular figure that Haggis saw on the training videos. He didn't seem self-important or pious. He was like the dashing, wisecracking hero of a B-movie who had seen everything and somehow had it all figured out. Hubbard was always chuckling to himself, marveling over some random observation that had just occurred to him, with a little wink to the audience suggesting that they not take him too seriously. He would just open his mouth and a mob of new thoughts would burst forth, elbowing each other in the race to make themselves known to the world. "You walked in one day and you said, 'I'm a seneschal,'" Hubbard observed in a characteristic aside, "and this knight with 8-inch spurs standing there, humph, and say, 'I'm supposed to open the doors to this castle. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm a very trusted retainer.'" He's insisting he's the seneschal, but nobody will pay him his wages and so forth. He was somebody before he became the seneschal. Now, as a seneschal, he became nobody until he finally went out and got a begging pan on the highway and began to hold it out for fish and chips as people came along, you know. Now he says, I am something. I am a beggar. But that's still something. Then the New York State Police come along, or somebody, and they say to him, I'm a little mixed up in my periods here, but they say to him, do you realize that you cannot beg upon the public road without license number 603F? So he starves to death and kicks the bucket, and there he lies. Now he's somebody. He's a corpse. But he's not dead. He's merely a corpse. Got the idea? But he goes through sequences of becoming nobody, somebody, nobody, somebody, nobody, somebody, nobody, not necessarily on a dwindling spiral. Some people get up to the point of being a happy man. You know the old story of a happy man. I won't tell it, but he didn't have a shirt. Just as this parable begins to ramble into incoherence, Hubbard comes to the point, which is that a being is not his occupation or even the body he presently inhabits. The central insight of Scientology is that a being is eternal, what Hubbard terms a thetan. This chap, in other words, was somebody until he began to identify his beingness with a thing. None of those beingnesses are the person. The person is the thetan. He had this amazing buoyancy, Haggis recalled. He had a deadpan sense of humor and this sense of himself that seemed to say, yes, I am fully aware that I might be mad, but I also might be onto something. The zealotry that empowered so many members of the church came from the belief that they were the vanguard of the struggle to save humanity. To advance such lofty goals, Hubbard developed a technology to attain spiritual freedom and discover oneself as an immortal being. Scientology works 100% of the time when it is properly applied to a person who sincerely desires to improve his life, a church publication declares. This guarantee rests on the assumption that through rigorous research, Hubbard had uncovered a perfect understanding of human nature. One must not stray from the path he has laid down or question his methods. Scientology is exact. Scientology is certain. Step by step, one can ascend toward clarity and power, becoming more oneself, but paradoxically also more like Hubbard. Scientology is the geography of his mind. Perhaps no individual in history has taken such copious internal soundings and described with so much logic and minute detail the inner workings of his own mentality. The method Hubbard put forward created a roadmap toward his ideal self. Hubbard's habits, his imagination, his goals, his wishes, his character, in other words, became both the basis and the destination of Scientology. Thank you.
Hi, very nice to be here tonight. This section is just a little diary entry from the point of view of a middle-aged guy who's married to a woman named Pam. And so that diary entry explains the kind of wonky syntax you'll hear in a minute. This is October 1st. Todd Grassberger funeral today at Ukrainian church downtown. Todd, apparently from humble roots. Priest equal long-haired guy in cassock. Sings, chants, whole service in Ukrainian from memory. As he chants, paces, cassock swings. Scary guy. Very intense. Sermon. Why this surprising? Did you think you were going to live forever? Only difference between you sitting there anticipating rest of your day, and Todd in coffin, bound for eternal home in cold earth, is heartbeat. Feel that, people, in your chest? That is thin line between you and grave. So why do you live like you are eternal? That foolish. You are fools. This scary, this not scary. This truth, this reality, shouts, shall we wake up? Shall we? Everyone staring big-eyed at priest, except usual congregants who seem to have heard all before. Priest goes on, which of us will die tonight? Do we think he's being facetious? That shows we are dopes. Any one of us could die tonight. Die right now. Suddenly come up short of breath, keel over in pew, be with Todd in earth in wink of eye. Suddenly from downstairs kitchen, smell of roast beef. Happy chatter from church ladies down in kitchen. Smell of roast beef plus sound of pots clanking, plates being set out, equal appealing. People shifting in pews due to amazing smell of beef. Todd's two brothers come to lectern, make tributes. Older brother, Todd sweet, Todd funny, Todd a powerful force in his life. We'll never forget, wonder, that was Todd. Younger brother, yes, Todd, super strong person. Todd equal bull. Although Todd could be somewhat firm, Todd did younger brother much good in long run. But by teaching him how to stand up for self. That is to say, having been pushed around by Todd throughout entire childhood, nothing can now faze younger brother, i.e., no bully in outside world will ever be equal of Todd. But Todd's so great. Todd the best. Todd's so smart, so good looking. No wonder Todd's mom plus dad always treated him, younger brother, like afterthought. But Todd, so caring, so perceptive. Todd understood this, would sometimes console younger brother by saying that he, younger brother, was perfectly fine in own way. Often just before breaking pact they had made, RE Wednesday night being younger brother's night to borrow dad's car, thereby ruining younger brother's chance to see girl he really liked. Possible love of life. Girl he eventually lost to dope from Selden. Dope whose own older brother apparently more inclined than Todd to give his younger brother decent shot at family car. Todd's younger brother, breathless, pauses at lectern. Can't seem to stop self. Plunges ahead. But Todd, great. Todd's so great. Todd will surely be missed. Todd taught everyone in family important lesson. Although a person might be strong, bellicose, ambitious, slightly blind to needs of others, still, that does not mean person not greatest, most amazing brother ever, who occasionally, as if to spite self, might suddenly, surprising all, do some reasonably thoughtful thing. Younger brother, seemingly perplexed by own tribute, then led away from lectern by scowling older brother, hissing something in undertone. Todd's widow approaches lectern, can't seem to speak. Three little girls clinging to her skirt. Widow hands microphone to smallest girl. Smallest girl, bye, Daddy. Lunch good. Lunch beyond good. Funeral so sad, lunch equal heaven. Eat 3 roast beef sandwiches in a row off paper plate. Outside, yellow tree blowing in wind. Single yellow leaf blows in through open basement window. Watch it come down, land near my shoe. Think, life beautiful. So glad I'm not dead. If, when I die, do not want Pam lonely. Want her to remarry, have full life. As long as new husband is nice guy, gentle guy, religious guy. Very caring plus good to kids. But kids not fooled. Kids prefer dead dad, i.e. me, to religious guy. Pale, boring religious guy with no oomph, who wears weird sweaters and is always a little sad due to cannot get boner, due to physical ailment. Death very much on my mind tonight, future reader. Can it be true that I will die? That Pam, kids will die? Is awful. Why were we put here so inclined to love when end of our story equal death? That harsh, that cruel, do not like. Note to self, try harder in all things to be a better person. Thank you.
So let's have one more round of applause for all of our finalists. I want to thank you guys all for coming out, you lovers of literature. I love it. And I want to thank the National Book Foundation and all the volunteers and staff. They work so hard to promote literature. They're a national treasure. So I think we should give them a round of applause as well, yeah? And lastly, a special thanks to Luis Jaramillo and Lori, the very lovely Lori Lynn Turner, who used to be my boss, and the New School for hosting this event. Yep. Thanks, guys. Good night.